Hi, my name's Cameron Holdaway, and today I'll be talking about measuring and predicting variation in the interestingness of physical structures. Humans naturally want to explore and learn about their environment. Babies turn their attention to look at novel stimuli, toddlers waddle around to explore their environment, and adults pay loads of money for that special trip to Bali to see and experience new things. However, this curious exploration is not limited to passively moving through the environment. It also includes choosing to intervene on and manipulate the things around us to create entirely new configurations of the world. So you might ask, what motivation underlies these exploratory behaviors? This intrinsic drive to intervene on the world is more common than you might think. Give any toddler a set of blocks and they will readily stack them into new and interesting structures. So what's going on here? Well, perhaps building towers from blocks is a precursor to all the amazing complex creating we do as humans. From tall buildings to complex software programs, we're constantly creating new things. And while we often undertake a building project to achieve some instrumental goal, building things is also just fun. But given that the tower that this kid is building is likely never to be used for anything important, what makes it worth doing? What makes this fun? One reason we may choose to engage in these types of behaviors is that intrinsic motivation conveys a learning signal. For example, in order to build complex structures, people rely on their internal model of how the world works to understand a physical scene. For example, this physical model may involve representing the relationship between objects, or maybe making predictions about the future. So one reason we might engage with the world this way is that we are intrinsically motivated to learn about how the world works. This intrinsic drive leads us to seek out structures that are informative, precisely because they challenge our physical understanding. This might explain why some things are more interesting than others. For example, a super tall Jenga tower is crazy because given how we think blocks and gravity ought to behave, it seems so precarious and just so unlikely. In this project, our goal is to understand what structures people find intrinsically motivating, and to explore possible features of a physical scene that elicit this signal. To try to answer this question, I'm going to present two main experiments that explore the relationship between physical structures and what makes them interesting to people. Our first experiment specifically looks at the types of towers that children choose to build. Our second experiment focuses on what people find intrinsically interesting without the confounding complexity that comes with open-ended building tasks. So the way we do this is by asking adults to rate pre-built towers rendered in a realistic three-dimensional physics environment. And then we'll finish with some future directions for the study of intrinsic motivation. Okay, let's jump into experiment one. In this experiment, we're interested in what types of towers kids choose to build in an open-ended environment. In this task, children were given 9 primitive plastic blocks and instructed to construct a cool tower. In total, we collected images of towers built by 53 children ages 2 to 6 using these plastic blocks. Immediately, you might already be thinking that some of these are cooler than others. But what we're interested in is why. What makes some cooler than others? As you can see, towers exhibit large variability in size, number of blocks, and object relations. So why do kids build these structures and not others? Some show preferences for support relations or multiple substructures, but it's not clear to what extent these are the product of specific intent or just because kids have little sausage fingers and limited motor capacity. While these unconstrained building tasks can give us really rich data, one downside is that these designs make it trickier to draw strong conclusions about what made them worth building in the first place. So what makes one tower cooler than another? To get some initial traction on what might explain variation across the towers that children built, we asked a group of 25 adult participants to simply rate them on an interestingness scale from 1 to 5. We found that ratings between people were surprisingly consistent. While towers varied in many ways, here I'm going to show the result of one analysis that spurred our future research, which is a strong relationship between tower height and rated interestingness. This plot shows the mean interestingness on the y-axis and the tower height on the x-axis. Adults consistently rated taller towers as more interesting. This finding suggests that we might be able to reverse engineer what intrinsic goals children might have had when building these structures. For example, perhaps these kids were motivated to build them as tall as possible, or maybe they chose specific object relations to test stability. So our first study gives us some insight into what children think is worthy of building, but it was limited in a few key ways. First, since it was a purely observational study, we can't draw strong causal inferences about the link between various tower properties and how interesting they are. Second, we can only take so many pictures. So we don't have precise information about all of the tower properties, such as which blocks were used where and exactly the size of each block or how it was placed. So how can we study intrinsic motivation without the complexity of construction tasks? Well, to overcome these limitations, in our second experiment, we take a much more controlled approach to the question of intrinsic motivation. This time, we're directly manipulating tower properties in a realistic virtual 3D environment. This 3D world can run simulated physics to mimic the playroom environment as closely as we can, with the added benefit of being able to track all of the physical properties of every object. So our approach for studying curiosity in physical scenes is to separate the core intrinsic motivation signal from the complex planning and building component. To accomplish this, we propose interestingness ratings as a new metric. We are assuming that people choose to imagine and build what they find interesting. For example, kids choose to build those towers because they found something interesting about them and they thought they were worth building. So instead of trying to measure complex construction behaviors, we study what people find interesting about pre-built structures simply by asking. And the goal of this is, if we can establish interestingness as a reliable measure that people agree on, we can compare various physical scenes in a systematic way to determine specifically what about them is intrinsically motivating. Building our initial findings from experiment 1, we manipulated tower height, the number of blocks, by generating towers of height 2, 4, or 8 blocks tall. We also manipulated the jitter or horizontal variation in the x-axis of these towers. So towers in the low condition had no jitter in the x position. In the medium jitter condition, each block's x position was sampled uniformly with a range equal to 1/3 of the block width. And then in the high jitter condition, each block's x position was sampled with range equal to 1/2 of the block width. So here are examples of two of the stimuli, one with 2 blocks and low jitter and the other with 8 blocks and high jitter. We created 72 towers with 2 viewpoints for each, yielding 144 total towers. The main advantage of these computer-generated towers is that we can forward simulate physics to get ground truth physical features. We recruited for this study 180 adult participants who rated every tower for either its interestingness or stability on a scale from 1 to 5. And here we can see the 3x3 design that jointly varies jitter and height. Each subject saw all towers from both viewpoints and rated either interestingness or stability. This figure shows average stability rating on the x-axis and interestingness ratings on the y-axis. Crucially, since interestingness had never been studied as a metric in this context, we compared inter-rater reliability between stability and interestingness ratings and found them to be equally reliable, which is really good. As you can see, there's a clear interaction between stability ratings and interestingness. Taller towers and those that are less stable were rated as more interesting, with the effect growing with tower height. The regions of this 3x3 grid roughly map onto our interestingness by stability plot. So here in the top left, high jitter 8 block towers were rated as most interesting and least stable. And here you can see that low jitter 2 block towers were rated as least interesting and most stable. And in a series of model comparisons, we found that tower height, variance in the x position or the jitter, and perceived stability were all strong predictors of interestingness, and that perceptual features like color or viewing angle were not significant. So are certain towers more interesting because they are surprising? The fact that taller and more jitter towers are more interesting leads to the idea that the more interesting towers are those that look like they're just on the verge of falling over. So you might think maybe precarious towers are more interesting because they provide more of a learning signal. Perhaps these towers violate our expectations and thus seem surprising. Or in other words, these towers tell you a lot about the configuration of the world, because if you were to just make small changes to the underlying physics, like changing block positions or the mass or the gravity, that would make them fall over, whereas normally they're standing. To operationalize this notion of surprisal and precariousness, we conducted a series of counterfactual simulations. So these simulations slightly vary the original sets of towers to determine which configurations are surprising or unlikely. To make this more concrete, here we're studying interestingness judgments as a form of physical simulation. And previous research has shown that some human physical reasoning can be explained by noisy simulations about what might have been or how the world might be. We're interested in whether interestingness ratings rely on similar simulations. So to do this, we constructed counterfactual perturbations to the block positions of our towers. Each block was randomly sampled with probability 0.5 to be adjusted from its original position. If selected, horizontal adjustments were sampled from a normal distribution centered at the original position with standard deviation equal to 1/4 of the block width. For each tower, we conducted 25 such simulations. And this essentially gives us 25 versions of how the tower might have been, or alternate realities. Because we used a realistic 3D physics engine, we can run the physics simulator forward for each counterfactual version of the tower and count how many of these are stable and how many fall over. From these simulations, the counterfactual sensitivity is something we can calculate as the proportion of these alternative towers that, after simulation, reached a different static equilibrium from the original, which is to say they fell over. What this simulation predicts is that if what we find interesting is principally based on a learning signal, then these outcomes that are surprising or unlikely could be the most interesting precisely because they are hard to predict. And we do indeed find that more precarious or counterfactually sensitive towers are more interesting. And here we plot counterfactual sensitivity on the x-axis with more unstable configurations having higher values, so further to the right, and the mean interestingness ratings for the original towers on the y-axis. Remarkably, this single feature explained most of the variance in mean tower interestingness ratings. More sensitive or unlikely towers were considered more interesting. Here we can see how this feature captures our intuition about the relationship between height jitter and perceived precariousness for a few example towers. What's really interesting about this is, crucially, constructing this model doesn't depend on the stimuli being towers at all. Really, any arrangement of physical objects could be counterfactually perturbed and simulated in this way. We could then assess whether the outcome was the same or different from what was observed. This suggests that this probabilistic notion of how the scene might have been or how the world could be could provide a more general principle underlying interestingness judgments. So to conclude, here are some future directions that will help expand and generalize these studies of intrinsic motivation. In these studies, we studied towers, but there are many possible physical scenes. In future directions, we hope to explore how these results generalize to other physical domains, such as dynamic rolling or collisions. In theory, any physical scene could be tested for counterfactual sensitivity, wherein scenes with more unlikely outcomes are perceived as more interesting, suggesting that violating expectations is a general signal for learning about physics. We also view this framing as a way to study curiosity from a developmental approach. We could ask if children and adults find the same things interesting, and are differences explained by different physics models or different motivation signals altogether. In future projects, we hope to expand this methodology to probe these intrinsic motivation differences across development. Thanks so much for listening. Special thanks to the entire team and all of our lab mates, and feel free to check us out on GitHub.